My daughter said I was too poor to meet her in-laws, never realizing they would one day see me in a light she could not have imagined. The words she spoke that day carried more than just the weight of the moment. They carried the spark of a truth waiting quietly beneath the surface, a truth that would rise when the time was right, and when it did, nothing in her world would ever look the same again. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. I remember the first time she looked at me with eyes that held distance rather than warmth, as if my years of labor were an embarrassment rather than a badge of honor, and though I kept my silence, inside I carried memories that refused to fade. I had worked the factory floors where the smell of grease never left my hands, taken night shifts when my body begged for rest, and walked through rain and snow to make sure she never missed a school day. Each sacrifice I made was wrapped in love. Each dollar I saved meant for her future, yet as she climbed higher into social circles, I felt her drifting further from me. To hear her say I was too poor to be seen by her fiancé's family cut deeper than any blade could, because she did not know that the very men and women she sought approval from knew my name, respected my contributions, and trusted me in ways she could never have imagined. I sat there that night, holding my tongue, while the past flooded through me, each memory like a candle illuminating the path I had walked for her sake. I thought of the nights I skipped meals so she could have seconds, the mornings I left before dawn so her tuition would be paid, the long hours spent counting coins at the kitchen table, wondering how to stretch them far enough to cover books, rent, and her dreams. She never asked how it all happened, perhaps assuming the world owed her comfort, but I knew every privilege she had was bought with my sweat and with choices that wore my body down before its time. The irony of her words that evening nearly made me smile, for unknown to her, the company her future in-laws ran stood on a foundation into which I had quietly placed the fruit of decades of labor. Silent investor, they called me. The man who signed papers without fanfare, the one who preferred solitude to spotlight. I had no need for acknowledgement, but as I listened to her disown me with her words, a thought began to form in the corners of my mind, quiet yet steady. Life has a way of turning circles, of lifting truth from shadows when least expected, and I felt deep within me that a day was coming when she would see not only who I was but what I had always been. I did not seek revenge, not in the way of bitterness, but I longed for the moment when respect would speak louder than pride, and when she would realize that wealth is not always worn in suits or displayed in cars, but in the unshakable strength of one who builds with his own two hands. That night, as she laughed with friends and distanced herself from me, I sat back, my silence a cloak, my patience a shield, and though her words echoed like a storm in my chest, I whispered to myself that storms eventually clear and reveal the sky beyond. What she could not know, what she would never have guessed, was that soon enough, the very people she tried to impress would stand before me with gratitude in their eyes, and she, my own blood, would learn that to call me poor was to misunderstand everything about me, everything I had endured, and everything I had quietly become. That was the beginning of a story that would turn her world upside down. And in that moment, I decided to let time speak for me, because sometimes the loudest truth comes not from anger, but from revelation. The sting of betrayal does not come from enemies. It comes from those whose voices once carried love. And when my daughter's lips formed the words that I was too poor to meet her in-laws, the echo of her rejection rang louder than any insult I had ever endured in my years of toil. For I had faced foremen barking orders, supervisors cutting my wages, and even neighbors who whispered about my worn shoes and patched jackets. But none of those stung the way her voice did that day, polished with pride yet sharpened by shame. A shame she pinned on me, as though I were a burden, rather than the very reason she could stand tall in her new world. I remember sitting alone after she said it, my hands folded on the table, the lines on my palms deeper than ever, staring at the same hands that had built her childhood, the same hands that had carried her when she was too tired to walk, the same hands that signed every check for her schooling, and I could not understand how the child who once held those hands so tightly now recoiled from them as if they were unworthy. I thought about the moments when she was younger and would run to me after a scraped knee, when my embrace was the only comfort she needed, when my voice could calm her fears and my presence was her sanctuary. Yet somewhere along the path of her growing years, I had become less in her eyes, as though the very sacrifices that had lifted her had also aged me into someone she no longer wished to claim. The words she chose were not simply careless, they were deliberate, designed to sever me from the shining image she wanted to present to her fiancé's family. An image polished with luxury and status, untouched by the grime of hard work. She had forgotten the nights when I skipped supper so she could have her fill, forgotten the winters when my coat was thin because I had bought her a new one, forgotten the times I turned down my own wants to make sure she never felt less than her peers. And yet here she was, declaring to others that I was not fit to be seen, not fit to sit at a table with those she considered above me. In that moment, I was not just hurt, I was hollowed out, as if the love I had poured into her life had been emptied from me with those few words, leaving me with nothing but the echo of all my sacrifices and the bitter taste of her rejection. Yet even as the sting settled into my chest, I could not bring myself to hate her, for beneath my sorrow was still the love of a father who remembered her first cries, her first steps, her first words. It was that love that made her words hurt so deeply, because if I had not cared, the insult would have slid off me like rain. But I cared too much. I had always cared too much. And so the betrayal sank into me, like a stone into still water, spreading ripples through every corner of my being. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the world outside, and I asked myself how a father should respond to such a wound. Should I confront her and demand respect, or should I walk away and leave her to the world she was so desperate to impress? But something within me whispered patience, whispered that life has its way of revealing truths, whispered that silence, though painful, would one day speak louder than anger ever could. I closed my eyes and let the memory of her insult settle into my heart, not as fuel for rage, but as a reminder of how far she had drifted from the girl I once knew. And I promised myself that when the day came for the truth to rise, I would be ready, and she would see me not through the lens of her pride, but through the unshakable reality of who I truly was. Memories of sacrifice come back to me like shadows that never left my side, for every word my daughter spoke about me being too poor dragged me deeper into the past where I had lived every day for her sake. And as I sat in silence, I remembered the years when sleep was a luxury and food was measured carefully so she would never feel hunger. The years when I took 2 jobs, sometimes 3, because one was never enough to pay tuition, rent, clothes, and books all at once. Yet I never complained because every dollar I earned felt like a step closer to her dreams. I remembered leaving home before the sun rose, the streets still quiet, the cold air biting at my cheeks as I walked to the bus stop, carrying the weight of exhaustion, but also the hope that one day she would stand taller than I ever could. I remembered coming home with my shirt soaked in sweat, hands roughened by machines and tools, body aching, but heart lifted by the sight of her asleep at the kitchen table, with her books spread out like wings around her, and I would smile, knowing that my struggle had given her the chance to study freely, to chase goals without the burden of poverty I had known in my youth. I remembered the times I borrowed money, not for myself, but to buy her the laptop she needed, the car that would take her to her first job interview, the extra lessons when she struggled with her courses, and every time I told myself it was worth it, because I was not investing in things, I was investing in her. Even when I worked overtime at the factory, my thoughts were of her, of how every hour added to the paycheck would ease her path, of how my tired eyes would one day be rewarded by seeing her graduate, succeed, and live a life brighter than mine. I remembered standing in the back of her graduation hall, too proud to sit among the crowd, tears in my eyes as she crossed the stage, and though she did not look for me in that sea of faces, I whispered to myself that she had done it, and that was enough. I remembered the nights when bills piled high and the choice between keeping the lights on and paying for her classes weighed on me, and I chose her classes every time, sitting in the dark with candles because her future mattered more than my comfort. I remembered the holidays when gifts for her meant nothing for me, but I never once resented it, for her joy was my reward, her smile my only need. All these memories rose up in me like a tide, each one a reminder that being called poor was never an insult when I chose to give everything to her, but hearing it from her lips made those sacrifices feel invisible, as if the world I built for her had vanished into thin air. Yet even as the pain of her words lingered, I knew those sacrifices were real, and they had shaped her life in ways she could not erase. And though she may deny me now, the truth of all I had done lived in her every success. I sat in my chair that evening, hands folded over the lines etched by years of labor, and I let the memories wash over me, both heavy and comforting. For they reminded me that I had never failed her, not once, and while she might see me as unworthy, I knew deep in my soul that no father could have given more, and that truth would one day rise like the sun, impossible to hide, impossible to deny. The rise of distance between us did not happen overnight. It was a slow unraveling, a thread pulled quietly until the fabric of closeness we once shared no longer held us together. And as I look back now, I can see the signs I once ignored, the subtle changes in her tone, the way her laughter no longer carried the same warmth when it was directed at me, the way her phone calls became shorter and her visits fewer as her world expanded into circles where I did not belong. I remember when she first brought home friends from her university, polished young people with fine clothes and easy smiles, and how she introduced me not with pride but with a hesitation that stung, as if the man who worked endless shifts to put food on the table was somehow an embarrassment among the children of bankers and businessmen. I told myself it was just a phase, that as she grew older she would remember the value of roots and the soil that had nourished her. But with each passing year her distance became clearer, and my presence at her side became something she sought to reduce rather than embrace. She began dressing differently, speaking with new words, adopting airs that did not belong to the little girl who once ran barefoot in the yard and begged me to push her higher on the swing. I noticed how her smile toward me dimmed when her fiancé entered the picture, a young man with polished shoes, a confident stride, and a family name that carried weight in business circles. At first, I believed she wanted to balance her two worlds, the humble life I had given her and the glamorous one she pursued with him. But soon I realized she was making a choice, and that choice was to step further away from me in order to step closer to them. The warmth that once lived in her voice when she said the word "Papa" turned into something clipped and almost formal, as if the word itself no longer fit her tongue. The dinners we once shared turned into rare occasions, and when we did sit at the same table, she filled the space with stories of parties and travels, leaving little room for me to speak of my quiet life of work and books and solitude. There was a day she asked me not to walk her into the university hall when she met with her professors, claiming it would look unprofessional, and though I agreed and stepped back, inside, I felt the first sharp cut of being left behind. Over time, such moments multiplied, each one a reminder that she was slipping further from me, building a life in which I was an accessory at best, a shadow she did not wish others to notice. The ring on her finger marked not only her engagement but also the widening of that distance, because with it came invitations where I was welcome only in formality but not in spirit, where I was present in name but not in heart. Her gaze, once full of affection, now carried the flicker of calculation, measuring how my presence might be perceived, and it was in those moments that I began to understand the depth of her drift. Yet through all this, I held my silence, telling myself that love is patient, that perhaps in her quest for acceptance she would one day remember the man who built her foundation. But as her laughter rang louder in the company of her fiancé's family and softer in mine, I felt the truth settle heavily on my chest, that my daughter, once my closest companion, was walking further into a world where I was no longer welcome, and the distance she chose grew like a wall between us, one brick at a time, until I stood on the other side, watching her back as she walked away. The wedding preparations should have been a season of joy for me. A father watching his only daughter step into a new chapter of her life, yet each detail seemed to carve me further out of the picture. And though my name appeared on the invitations, and I was given polite acknowledgement, there was a coldness beneath it all that made me feel less like family and more like an outsider tolerated out of necessity. I remember how she invited me to the ceremony with words that felt rehearsed, her smile thin, her eyes avoiding mine as she handed me the card, and I could sense she was already planning how to keep me in the shadows, away from the polished presence of her fiancé's family. When meetings were held with the in-laws to discuss menus, decorations, and traditions, I was never asked to join, never told the dates until they had already passed. And when I asked casually about the preparations, she would deflect with vague answers or say she was busy, as though my curiosity itself was unwelcome. I overheard her once telling a cousin that the dinner with her fiancé's parents was meant to be small and private, a meeting between families of equal standing, and in that single word equal, I heard the verdict she had quietly passed on me, that in her eyes I did not measure up, that the years I spent breaking my body to provide her education, the very education that had allowed her to rise into this world, meant nothing when compared to the polish of inherited wealth and prestige. She told me with forced politeness that I could sit with some of the extended relatives during the reception, not at the front with the immediate family, and though she smiled as she said it, her tone carried the sharpness of distance, making it clear she did not want me anywhere near the places where her new in-laws would be seated. I nodded quietly, because, what could I say? A father does not beg for a place in his daughter's joy, yet in my chest something tightened, not from anger but from the ache of being cast aside. When the planners spoke of photographs and seating arrangements, she found ways to excuse me, to move me to the corners of the pictures, to assign me tasks that kept me away from the spotlight, as if she feared my presence would tarnish the image she wished to present. I heard whispers among the guests that her fiancé's family was wealthy, that their estate was grand, their company thriving, and I knew then that she was working tirelessly, not only to please them, but to prove she belonged. And in her quest to belong, she had decided, I must be hidden, the man whose hands carried the marks of labor, whose suits were modest and worn, who could not be polished into the kind of father she wanted to display. As I prepared for the day, I polished my shoes, pressed my one good suit, and told myself that my love for her mattered more than appearances, but deep down I carried the heaviness of knowing that even in her most important moment she was doing all she could to keep me at arm's length, and that knowledge sank into me like a stone, heavy and unrelenting. Yet still, I resolved to walk into that hall with dignity, to hold my head high, because I knew that my worth was not written on fabric or jewels. It was written in the years of sacrifice that had carried her to that very moment. And though she tried to hide me in the margins, I understood that without me, the story of her wedding could never have been written at all. The humiliation came quietly at first, in words spoken when she thought I was too far away to hear, and it was during one of those evenings when relatives and friends gathered to finalize the wedding details that I overheard her voice, light but sharp, saying she did not want me embarrassing her in front of her fiancé's parents because of how poor I looked. And those words settled into my chest like a weight that refused to move. I stood just beyond the doorway, hidden by the dim light of the hallway, listening as she laughed softly with someone, perhaps a cousin or a friend, and spoke of me not as her father, but as a problem to be managed, as though I were a stain she feared would spread across her carefully polished image. In that moment, I felt the air leave me, not from anger, but from a kind of sorrow I cannot fully describe. For I had endured insults from strangers before, men who mocked my worn hands, neighbors who whispered about the small house I lived in. But to hear my own daughter speak of me as though I were less than her blood cut deeper than anything I had ever endured. I remembered the countless times I had walked through storms with holes in my shoes so she would never feel the rain on hers, and now she worried that those same shoes, though polished and mended, would bring shame to her in front of people she barely knew. I thought of the nights I returned home too tired to eat, falling asleep in my chair so she could have a warm meal without knowing I had gone hungry. And yet she feared that my presence at her table would remind others of sacrifice instead of wealth. As I listened, I felt the sting of invisibility, the cruel truth that my years of giving had not elevated me in her eyes, but had instead been twisted into proof of my unworthiness. I wanted to step into that room, to remind her that the only reason she stood tall in that moment was because I had bent low for so many years to lift her higher. But my pride held me back because a father does not beg for respect. He carries his dignity in silence, even when it feels heavy. I walked away from that door with slow steps, each one heavier than the last, and in my heart I asked myself if love alone could survive such humiliation. Later that evening, when she smiled at me across the table as though nothing had been said, I saw the mask she wore, the one that tried to bridge the distance with politeness while hiding the truth she had spoken. And I realized then that I would not forget those words. They would follow me into the night. They would echo in my thoughts. And though I would continue to love her as only a father can, I knew something had changed. Something had cracked. And no matter how much I tried to mend it, the sound of her dismissing me as unworthy would remain, etched into my memory like a scar carved by the very hand I had once held so gently. Memories of devotion flooded me after that night, memories that no insult could erase. For even as my daughter's words stung like salt on an open wound, I could not help but remember the countless times I had stood in her corner, giving her everything I had so that she would never know the hunger, the struggle, or the emptiness that defined much of my own youth. I thought of the first time she asked me for help with her studies, the way she sat at the kitchen table with books spread out before her, her small hands clutching a pencil too tightly, tears welling in her eyes when the numbers confused her, and how I sat with her for hours, guiding her gently until her frown turned into a smile, and that smile made every moment of exhaustion worthwhile. I remembered the day she was accepted into college, the letter trembling in her hands, her voice breaking with excitement as she read it aloud. And though she never knew it, I cried that night in my room, not just from pride but from relief, because every double shift, every sleepless night, every blister on my palms had brought her to that moment. I remembered selling my old car, the one I had saved for years to buy, just so she could have a reliable vehicle to drive herself to classes. And I never hesitated, because I believed her future mattered more than any comfort of mine. I remembered sitting with her before her first job interview, helping her choose the right outfit, rehearsing answers with her, and encouraging her when nerves threatened to undo her confidence. And when she came home with the news that she got the job, I felt as if I had been hired myself, for her victory was always my own. I remembered birthdays where the cake was small and the gifts modest, but her joy filled the room so completely that I never cared about the size of the celebration, only the light in her eyes. I remembered winters where I worked overtime just to buy her a coat warm enough to shield her from the cold, and summers where I saved so she could attend the trips her classmates boasted about, never letting her feel different or less fortunate. Every memory was a thread woven into the fabric of her life, a quiet devotion that asked for nothing in return but her happiness. And though she now sought to cast me aside, those years could not be undone. I knew in my heart that without me, she would not have stood where she did, confident and admired by the world she now longed to impress, and yet she had forgotten the man who had lifted her there. I let these memories flow through me like a tide, steady and strong, because they reminded me of the truth that while she may dismiss me as poor, I had given her a wealth greater than gold, a wealth of love, guidance, and sacrifice. And that truth would always remain, even if she never acknowledged it. Sitting alone, I whispered to myself that devotion does not vanish. It leaves its mark in every success, in every triumph. And though she may try to erase me from her present, she could never erase me from the foundation of her life. The business secret was something I had carried quietly for years, hidden behind the plain clothes and tired face of a man no one would ever suspect of holding such power. And as my daughter dismissed me with the word poor, I almost laughed to myself, because she had no idea that the very empire her fiancé's family boasted about stood in part upon the foundation of my own sacrifices and decisions. Decades earlier, when most men I knew spent their wages as quickly as they earned them, I had chosen another path, putting aside what little I could, investing carefully, reading every book I could find about markets and growth, listening to advice from those wiser than me, and taking risks that kept me awake at night but paid off over time. Each paycheck I brought home was divided with care, some for food, some for bills, some for her needs, and a small, stubborn portion tucked away into investments that most would have called foolish for a man of my standing. Over the years, those small sums grew, slowly at first, then steadily, until I found myself holding shares in companies that others envied, shares that brought not only dividends but also influence, though I never used it to boast or to climb social ladders. Among those investments was a quiet but significant stake in the company run by my daughter's future in-laws, a business I had watched rise from modest beginnings into a powerhouse, and with each step of its growth, my role as a silent investor deepened, my name present in documents but never in conversations. I preferred it that way, For I never sought applause, only stability, only the knowledge that my years of labor were building something lasting. My daughter never knew, because I did not think she needed to, and perhaps I feared she would look at me differently if she realized the man who fixed broken chairs and wore patched jackets was also the man whose decisions fueled fortunes. It amused me at times to sit in my small kitchen, counting dividends over a simple meal of bread and soup, while headlines praised the brilliance of the executives whose company thrived on the strength of investments like mine. The secret gave me a quiet strength, a reminder that poverty is not always what it seems, that wealth does not always shout from rooftops. Sometimes it waits in silence, content to let others assume what they will. So when she said I was too poor to meet them, I knew she was speaking from ignorance, not truth. And though her words pierced my heart, they could not strip away what I had built in the shadows. I told myself then that the day would come when silence would no longer hold the secret, when the truth would step into the light not because I forced it, but because life itself has a way of revealing what has long been hidden, and on that day she would understand that the father she dismissed had been the quiet hand holding up the very family she so admired. Until then, I carried the business secret like a shield, not to strike her with, but to remind myself that her judgment was not the measure of my worth, and that while she saw a man of worn clothes and weary steps, the world of business saw a name written on contracts that carried weight beyond her imagination. The daughter's coldness became sharper with each passing day as the wedding drew closer, and though she spoke to me with politeness in public, behind closed doors her words carried the edge of dismissal, reminding me that she wanted distance more than connection. I remember the evening she called me, her tone clipped and efficient, telling me not to come to the private engagement dinner because it was a moment meant only for the two families to bond, and though I was her father, she said it in a way that made me feel like an intruder rather than the man who had raised her. I stayed silent for a moment, the phone warm in my hand, listening to the faint impatience in her breathing as if she hoped I would not argue. And in that silence, I felt a weight settle on me, heavier than any burden I had carried in the factory or on the long shifts that broke my back. She did not want me there, not because there was no space at the table, but because she feared what my presence might say about her. Feared that the lines on my face, the wear of my suit, and the humility in my voice would not match the grandeur she wanted to project. I told her quietly that I understood, though every word burned in my chest, and after she hung up, I sat alone at the table where I had once helped her with her schoolwork, the same table where she had cried over failed tests and smiled over victories, and I wondered how she had come to see me as something to hide. The coldness in her voice was not new. It had grown over time, but now it was clear, undeniable, and final, and I knew then that she was determined to shut me out of the parts of her life that she believed defined her worth. I tried to tell myself she was nervous, that perhaps she wanted the evening to be perfect and thought my presence might complicate it, but deep inside I knew the truth that she believed I would bring shame where she wanted to shine. It was a cruel thought, but I let it settle because there was no fighting it, and instead I sat with the ache of being told by my own flesh and blood that I was not welcome in the circle of her new life. That night I stared out the window, watching the streetlights flicker in the distance, and I realized that the warmth we once shared was gone, replaced by a coldness that no sacrifice could melt. And though I loved her still, I began to understand that love alone could not bridge the gap she had chosen to widen. The father's resolve took root in me on the night she told me not to come to the private dinner, and though her words had cut me like a blade, leaving me hollow for a moment, I found within myself a strength I had not felt in years, a quiet and unshakable determination that I would no longer let her dismissal define who I was or erase what I had built. I sat alone in my small kitchen, the old clock ticking on the wall, and I thought of every sacrifice I had made, every coin I had saved, every moment of labor that had shaped my life, and I knew then that her shame could not strip me of my worth, for my worth was carved into time itself, into decades of perseverance, into the silent investments that now tied me to the very empire she wished to impress. I told myself that I would not storm into her world with anger. I would not raise my voice or demand respect, for such things are temporary and easily dismissed, but instead I would wait for the right moment, the moment when truth could no longer be hidden, and when that moment came, the revelation would be undeniable. My resolve was not born of revenge, though pain had certainly given it shape, but of justice, of the certainty that one day she would have to look at me not as a burden, but as a man whose life had been the backbone of her success. I made a decision that night that I would attend the gathering regardless of her request, not to embarrass her or to make a scene, but to stand in my place as her father with the dignity that no insult could take from me. I would walk into that room with the same quiet strength that had carried me through years of hardship, the same strength that had paid for her schooling and kept her clothed and safe, and though she might wish me to be invisible, I would let the truth speak for me. I imagined the look on her face when the discussion of investors inevitably arose, for in business circles such things cannot remain hidden for long, and when my name was spoken, the silence that followed would not only reveal who I was, but also force her to see me in a light she had long tried to ignore. That image gave me courage, not because I longed to see her humbled, but because I longed for her to finally understand that the man she had cast aside was the very man her new family already held in esteem. My resolve grew stronger as the days passed, as I ironed my old suit and polished my shoes, preparing not just for a dinner but for the moment when truth would no longer be hidden. I told myself that I would walk into that mansion with my head high, not as the poor man she believed me to be, but as the father who had built a life of quiet power and sacrifice, and when the time came, I would reveal it not with pride, but with calm certainty. The resolve was like a flame within me, steady and unwavering, and it carried me through the whispers of doubt, through the sting of her words, through the ache of years spent giving without acknowledgement. I knew the moment was near when silence would end and truth would rise, and until then, I carried my resolve like armor, protecting me from her coldness, guiding me toward the day when she and everyone else would finally see me as I truly was. The dinner gathering arrived on a night filled with quiet tension, the kind that settles into your chest long before you step through the door. And as I made my way to the in-laws' mansion, I could feel the weight of years pressing against me. The years of sacrifice, the years of silence, the years of being dismissed. And yet, beneath all that weight was the steady pulse of resolve that reminded me why I was there, not to beg for acceptance, but to claim the dignity that had always been mine. The mansion stood tall and bright, its lights spilling across the driveway, where elegant cars gleamed like jewels. And as I walked up the stone steps in my simple but carefully pressed suit, I could feel the difference between their world and mine, but I refused to let it shake me, for I knew that true worth is not measured in marble floors or golden chandeliers, but in the endurance of a life lived with purpose. The doors opened, and I was greeted with warmth by attendants who did not know my name, but treated me with courtesy nonetheless. And as I entered the grand hall, I saw the family gathered, their voices blending in laughter and conversation, their glasses lifted high with wine that sparkled under the light. My daughter was there, her gown shimmering as she moved gracefully among the guests. But when her eyes met mine, there was a flicker of discomfort, a shadow of unease that crossed her face before she forced a smile that did not reach her eyes. She walked quickly to her fiancé's side, clinging to his arm as though to remind herself and others where she now belonged, and I stood quietly for a moment, letting the scene unfold, letting the chatter and music fill the air around me. The in-laws were gracious, their gestures open and polite, welcoming me into their home without hesitation, though I could sense their curiosity, a curiosity that would later find its answer when business matters surfaced. My daughter avoided introducing me properly, mumbling something about me being her father before quickly steering the conversation away, her cheeks slightly flushed as if she hoped no one would linger on me too long. I noticed how she guided the discussion toward the upcoming wedding, the decorations, the guest list, anything to keep me in the background, and though it hurt to see her so eager to distance herself, I remained calm, knowing my moment would come. I listened as the in-laws spoke proudly of their company, their achievements, their future plans, and I could not help but think how strange it was to sit in the room as both father of the bride and the silent partner, whose investments kept their empire secure, yet remain unseen by those who thought they held the full measure of the story. The food was served with elegance, dishes I could barely pronounce, but appreciated nonetheless, and I ate quietly, watching the way my daughter laughed more easily with them than with me, her voice bright, her smile practiced, her pride evident. Yet even as she tried to push me to the edges of the gathering, I felt no need to force myself into the center because I knew the truth did not need to shout, it only needed to be revealed in its time. As the evening continued, I spoke politely when addressed, offering few words, but carrying myself with the quiet composure of a man who has nothing to prove. And though I was not the center of attention, I noticed more than once the way the in-laws' eyes lingered on me, as though they sensed there was more to me than what they saw. My daughter, however, grew increasingly tense, stealing glances at me, as if afraid I might say something that would shatter the image she had so carefully crafted. But I remained steady, content to wait, knowing that the dinner was not only about introductions, but about truth rising from the shadows. And so I sat in that grand room, surrounded by wealth and pride, treated with courtesy yet kept at arm's length by my own blood, and I held on to the patience that had carried me through years of labor, for I knew the night was far from over, and before it ended, the quiet secret of who I truly was would step into the light, and no amount of avoidance could change it. The daughter's dismissal that evening was sharper than any cold glance or hurried excuse she had given before, for when the moment finally came for her to introduce me to her fiancé's parents, she did so with a tone that stripped me of identity, calling me just my father before steering the conversation away as though I were no more than a distant acquaintance, and in that instant, I felt the full weight of her shame pressing against me. The shame she carried, not because I had failed her, but because in her eyes I did not shine brightly enough to stand beside the polished image she had built for herself. I sat there in silence, my face calm, though inside me the memory of every sacrifice rose like a tide, each reminder of the nights I had worked through exhaustion, the years I had spent choosing her future over my own comfort, the countless ways I had lifted her from nothing into the very place she now stood. Yet here she was pushing me into the shadows, as though my presence threatened to unravel her performance. Her voice, once sweet and filled with affection, carried a flatness that evening, and the words my father sounded more like a formality than a bond, a label she was forced to acknowledge before quickly burying it beneath the chatter of wedding plans and stories that glorified her fiancé's family. I watched the way she lit up when speaking of them, how her words flowed easily as she praised their generosity, their influence, their refined lifestyle, and I could see clearly that she wanted nothing more than to be counted among them, to be recognized as part of their shining circle, even if it meant dimming me to the point of invisibility. She leaned into her fiancé's mother with admiration, complimenting her jewelry, praising her taste, while I remained seated with my hands folded neatly, every line on my face a story she wished no one would read. My daughter did not look at me when she laughed. She did not pause to include me when she recounted stories of her childhood. And if anyone at that table had not known who I was, they might have believed I was no more than a guest brought in by mistake. Yet despite the sting, I kept my composure, for I knew what she did not. I knew that the very people she sought to impress already owed me a debt far greater than she could comprehend. And though she tried to bury me beneath her pride, the truth of who I was could not remain hidden forever. I studied the in-laws' faces as they nodded politely, noticing the flicker of curiosity in their eyes when she spoke so lightly of me, as though they wondered why she was so quick to move the conversation away. And I felt then that the time was approaching when those unspoken questions would demand answers. The food arrived in courses, elegant and unfamiliar, yet my thoughts were not on the meal, but on the way my daughter leaned further from me with every passing moment, as if even my silence threatened her image, and I realized that she no longer saw me as the man who had raised her, but as a burden she carried reluctantly, a name she had to mention, but a presence she did not want. Still, I did not flinch. I did not let her coldness break me, for deep within I held on to the quiet certainty that her dismissal would not last forever, that her attempt to cast me into the shadows would be shattered when the truth of my place in that family's world came to light. And so I endured her dismissal with patience, keeping my voice steady, my posture strong, my dignity intact, because though she tried to silence me with her words, I knew the silence itself was only temporary. And the day was coming when she would no longer be able to reduce me to just her father, but would be forced to see me for who I truly was. The turning point came slowly, not in an eruption of voices or sudden confrontation, but in the natural flow of conversation around that long, polished table where the in-laws, glowing with wealth and comfort, began to discuss the matters of their business, their voices rising with pride as they spoke of contracts, partnerships, and the future of their company. And I listened quietly, my hands resting calmly on the table, knowing that every word brought them closer to the truth they had yet to realize. They spoke of market expansions, of bold projects that would require significant backing, and one of the uncles at the far end raised his glass to toast the importance of their investors, calling them the lifeblood of the enterprise. And the others agreed with nods and murmurs of approval. My daughter laughed along with them, though her laughter carried an edge of nervousness, as if the subject itself brushed too close to a secret she did not understand, and I felt her glance toward me for the briefest second before looking away again, hoping I would remain silent. The conversation deepened as one of the elder family members began to recall the earliest days of their company's growth, when a few key investors had provided the stability they needed to climb from uncertainty into strength. And with reverence, he spoke of one in particular, a man who had always remained in the background, who never sought applause, but whose name was known to all in the family's boardrooms. My daughter shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to change the subject by complimenting the dessert, but the current of conversation was too strong to redirect, and soon the patriarch himself, her fiancé's father, leaned back in his chair and declared that it was long overdue for them to properly honor their largest investor, a man who had not yet been formally introduced in their gatherings. Though his influence touched everything they did, I felt the air shift in that moment, the way a room quiets just before a storm breaks, and though no one looked at me yet, I knew the path of their words was bending inevitably toward my name. My daughter's cheeks flushed, her hands tightening around her glass, her forced smile stiffening as though she sensed the ground trembling beneath her. And in that silence I remained calm, not needing to push the moment forward because it was already unfolding as it was meant to. For years I had carried my identity as a silent investor like a shield, hidden and unspoken, allowing others to believe what they wished while I lived with the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth. But here, in this grand hall, the lines of secrecy and revelation were drawing together, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing against us all. The in-laws spoke with admiration of the anonymous partner whose patience and steady contributions had kept them strong through storms in the market, a man whose decisions had made possible the very comforts they enjoyed. And still my daughter sat stiffly, her eyes darting anywhere but toward me, perhaps afraid to even imagine what was coming. The conversation hung on the edge, names about to be spoken, truths about to be unveiled, and though I said nothing, I felt the strength of my resolve burn brighter within me, for I knew that when the silence broke and my name filled the air, there would be no turning back, no more dismissals, no more hiding, only the undeniable reality that the father she had pushed into the shadows was the very man whose shadow stretched over everything she sought to embrace. And so I waited, my expression calm, my heart steady, knowing that this turning point was not of my making but of life itself, and that soon enough the truth would rise into the light where no denial could reach it. The reveal arrived with the weight of inevitability, a moment that seemed to pull the entire room into silence as her fiancé's father, seated at the head of the table with his glass raised, spoke my name clearly and with reverence, declaring that it was this man, this quiet and steadfast investor, who had provided the company with its most critical support. And as the sound of my name echoed through that grand dining hall, every conversation halted, every fork stilled in midair, and every eye turned toward me with a mixture of shock, recognition, and newfound respect. For a heartbeat I remained still, letting the words settle, letting the silence stretch until it wrapped around the room like a cloak, and I could feel the gaze of my daughter burning into me, her face frozen in disbelief, as if the ground had opened beneath her. She had called me too poor. She had dismissed me as unworthy of introduction, and now she sat pale and trembling while the truth unfolded in front of her, undeniable and irrefutable. I rose slowly, not with haste or arrogance, but with the calm dignity of a man who had spent a lifetime carrying weight without complaint, and I offered a polite nod to the man who had spoken my name, thanking him quietly for his kind words, though in my heart I knew this was more than kindness. This was recognition long delayed. The in-laws looked at me differently now, no longer with the vague politeness reserved for an aging father of the bride, but with the sharp, attentive eyes one gives to a man of influence, a man whose presence commands the room even when he does not speak. My daughter lowered her gaze, her lips pressed tightly, as though to stop herself from crying out, and I wondered if in that moment she replayed every word she had spoken about me, every attempt to hide me, every cruel dismissal that now hung like a shadow over her. I did not gloat, I did not smile in triumph, for the reveal itself was enough, and I felt no need to add weight to the lesson life was already teaching her. The patriarch rose from his seat and walked toward me, his hand extended, his eyes shining with respect, and when he clasped my hand firmly in his own, the gesture carried more power than any speech could have, for it was the acknowledgment not only of my role in their company, but of my worth as a man. Around us, relatives whispered, nodding, some looking at my daughter with thinly veiled curiosity, as though trying to reconcile the image she had painted of me with the reality that now stood in front of them. Her fiancé, too, looked shaken, his arms stiff around her shoulders, and I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes as he realized that the father he had, perhaps judged too quickly, was the very man whose investments underpinned his family's prosperity. The reveal was not a performance. It was not planned or orchestrated by me. It was simply the truth rising at last into the light. And in that truth there was a power greater than any words of mine could summon. I remained standing as the in-laws spoke their gratitude, thanking me for years of trust and support, their voices full of admiration, and I answered each one with modesty, because I had never invested for applause, only for the stability that would one day provide my daughter the very comfort she now enjoyed. Yet even as I accepted their thanks, I could not ignore the image of my daughter shrinking into her chair, her pride crumbling, her shame pouring into the silence she had once filled with laughter. And though part of me grieved to see her brought low, another part knew this was the lesson she needed, the lesson that respect is not measured in appearances or wealth displayed, but in the quiet strength of a life lived with sacrifice and honor. The reveal had come, and with it, the world she had built upon illusions cracked, leaving her no choice but to face the truth of who her father was and always had been. The in-laws' recognition unfolded with a grace that felt almost surreal, for as soon as the weight of my name settled over the room, they moved not with hesitation but with genuine reverence, rising from their seats one after another, until I found myself surrounded by gestures of respect that no amount of pride or dismissal could erase, and their voices, once filled with casual conversation, now carried warmth and gratitude as they approached me with handshakes, nods, and words that seemed to lift the years of silence from my shoulders. Her fiancé's father clasped my hand firmly, his eyes shining with admiration as he thanked me for the steady faith I had shown in their company during its most fragile years, and his wife placed her hand gently over mine, speaking of how my silent trust had allowed them to grow in ways they had never imagined, her tone filled with the kind of honor usually reserved for heroes, not for quiet men like me. I stood calmly, returning their gestures with measured grace, my heart steady, even as my daughter sat frozen beside her fiancé, her face pale, her lips parted as though she wished to speak but could not find the words, and in that silence her shame seemed to grow heavier by the second. The uncles and cousins gathered closer, some raising their glasses in a toast to me, others speaking of how they had long wanted to meet the mysterious investor whose name appeared on every report, and I felt the circle of respect tighten around me, transforming me from the shadow my daughter had tried to push aside into the very center of the gathering. I noticed the way their eyes lingered on me now, no longer passing over me as though I were invisible, but studying me with the attentiveness reserved for men whose voices matter, and though I spoke little, my few words carried weight because they came from a place of quiet confidence earned through years of sacrifice and discipline. My daughter shifted in her chair, her hands twisting nervously around the stem of her glass, her cheeks flushing as she realized that every nod of respect directed at me was also a mirror, reflecting her arrogance back at her, and while she sat trembling, I remained calm, not because I sought her humiliation, but because I understood that life itself had brought us to this moment. The patriarch's voice rang above the murmurs as he declared openly that their family owed me more than they could ever repay, that my trust had been the anchor that steadied them through storms, and his words carried across the table like a benediction, sealing the truth in a way no denial could undo. I bowed my head slightly in acknowledgement, speaking softly of how I had only done what felt right, of how I had invested not for glory but for stability. And though my words were modest, the room absorbed them with reverence, as though every syllable held more than I intended. My daughter's fiancé looked at me with a new light in his eyes, the arrogance he once carried tempered by a recognition that seemed to humble him, and I wondered if in that instant he saw me, not as the poor old man his future wife had described, but as the quiet architect of his family's fortune. The recognition grew like a tide, washing over the entire room until even the distant relatives who had barely noticed me earlier now approached with smiles and gestures of gratitude. And though part of me wanted to retreat into the shadows again, I stood firm, knowing that this moment was not about pride but about truth, a truth that demanded to be seen. Through it all, my daughter sat silent, her head lowered, her voice gone, and I understood that the recognition I received from her in-laws was not only a revelation to them, but also the beginning of a reckoning for her, one that would force her to confront the man she had tried so hard to erase from her story. And so I accepted their recognition with quiet dignity, allowing their words to flow around me without swelling into pride. For I knew that this was not the end of the journey, but the moment when truth finally rose to the surface, unshakable and undeniable, leaving no room for her to hide from what she had done. The daughter's shock was written all over her face, a look that no amount of poise or practiced smiles could conceal. For as the in-laws surrounded me with gratitude and honor, she sat rigid in her chair, her body stiff, her lips trembling, her eyes darting from me to them as if trying to make sense of a reality that had shattered the illusion she had so carefully built. And in that instant, the proud, confident daughter who had dismissed me as poor seemed to vanish, replaced by a woman undone by the weight of truth. She had spent months hiding me from their gaze, crafting excuses, limiting my presence, speaking of me in ways that kept me small, and yet now, before her entire new family, I was revealed not as the burden she claimed, but as the pillar upon which their empire stood, and the humiliation of that contrast burned in her cheeks until her face glowed red with shame. She tried to lift her glass to her lips, but her hand shook, the wine trembling dangerously near the rim, and I saw the way her fiancé placed his hand over hers to steady it, though his eyes were fixed on me with a respect she had never offered. My daughter avoided my gaze, staring instead at the tablecloth as if the patterns woven into the fabric might swallow her whole. But no matter how much she tried to retreat into silence, the truth pressed in around her. Every handshake I received, every word of admiration directed at me, another reminder of the arrogance that had driven her to belittle me. I wondered what thoughts tore through her mind at that moment, whether she replayed the countless times she had dismissed me, the cruel remark that I was too poor to meet them, the warning she whispered to others, not to let me embarrass her, and whether each memory now returned to her with the sting of regret. Her pride, once so polished, crumbled before my eyes, for pride cannot withstand exposure to truth, and as the in-laws praised me openly, she could not hide behind laughter or quick diversions. She could only sit and endure the collapse of the image she had tried so desperately to uphold. The silence that clung to her was louder than any outburst could have been, and though part of me longed to reach across the table and remind her that I was still her father, that my love for her had not vanished, another part of me knew this was the moment she needed to face, the moment when life itself forced her to see what she had become. Around us the conversation flowed with admiration, but between her and me there was a gulf wider than any words could bridge, a gulf she had created and that now swallowed her whole, leaving her trapped in the realization that the man she had dismissed was the very foundation of her new life. I did not gloat. I did not let triumph show on my face, because this was not a victory born of malice, but a truth that had simply come to light. And though her shock brought her low, I knew it was the only way she would ever learn the lesson, that respect cannot be faked, cannot be denied, cannot be stripped away by pride. She sat in that chair, with her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles white, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and I felt a heaviness in my chest that was not satisfaction but sorrow. Sorrow that it had taken such a moment to open her eyes. Sorrow that the daughter I had raised with so much love now looked at me as though seeing me for the very first time. Her shock was the breaking point, the crumbling of the wall she had built between us, and though she did not yet speak, I could feel the silence between us carrying the weight of 1,000 words unsaid, words of regret, words of apology, words she was not yet ready to release, but that pressed heavily against her lips. And so I remained steady, allowing her to sit in the truth of her own making, knowing that the shock on her face was not only the unraveling of her pride, but also the beginning of her reckoning, the moment when she would have no choice but to confront the reality of who I was and what she had done. The public confrontation unfolded not with shouting or anger, but with the undeniable force of recognition. For as the in-laws continued to shower me with gratitude, praising my foresight, my trust, and my unwavering support, their words grew louder and clearer until they filled the entire hall, leaving no room for my daughter to hide behind her silence. And as she sat shrinking into her chair, the patriarch raised his glass once more, this time declaring for all to hear that without me, their family business would not stand as it did today, a declaration that turned every eye toward me and then toward her, for the room now demanded an acknowledgment that could no longer be delayed. I remained calm, my hands folded neatly before me, yet inside I felt the weight of years lifting as justice unfolded before my eyes, not through vengeance but through truth. And though I had no intention of humiliating her, the in-laws' admiration became a mirror that forced her to confront the cruel words she had spoken about me, words that now rang hollow in the face of the respect that poured from every corner of the room. One of the uncles leaned forward, his voice curious yet kind, asking my daughter why she had never spoken of me in the light of what I had accomplished, and her lips parted but no words came, only a faint stammer that betrayed the turmoil inside her. And in that silence the truth hung heavy, exposing the distance she had created between us, not out of necessity but out of pride. The in-laws looked puzzled, their brows furrowing as they considered the way she had brushed me aside earlier, introducing me with no warmth, no pride, when in reality I was the man who had silently carried the company's future on my back. Her fiancé's mother, elegant and composed, placed a hand gently on my shoulder and called me family with a sincerity that made my daughter's eyes glisten with unshed tears. And the contrast between that warmth and her earlier dismissal was so stark that even the younger relatives whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward her with curiosity and judgment. Still, I did not raise my voice or point a finger. I simply let the moment breathe, for the public acknowledgment of who I was had already become the confrontation she could not escape. And the longer the room praised me, the clearer it became that her silence was an answer in itself, an answer that revealed her shame more loudly than any argument could. My daughter lowered her head, her shoulders hunched as if the very weight of the truth pressed down on her, and though part of me ached to see her so broken, another part knew this was the only way she would learn, that a father's worth is not measured by the polish of his shoes, or the size of his house, but by the sacrifices he makes and the life he builds quietly, steadily, without complaint. The in-laws spoke openly now of their gratitude, recalling stories from board meetings, moments when my name had been invoked with respect, and each memory they shared became another stone laid at my feet, building a monument of truth that she could not topple with her dismissals. Her fiancé looked at her with a questioning gaze, his brow raised as though silently asking why she had never told him, and she turned her face away, unable to meet his eyes, knowing that any excuse she might give would collapse beneath the weight of what had just been revealed. I took a sip of water, my hand steady, and spoke softly into the silence that followed, telling them that I had never sought recognition, that all I had ever wanted was stability for those I loved. And though my words were simple, they carried across the room with the strength of honesty, a strength that silenced even the whispers. My daughter finally looked at me then, her eyes wide, her face pale, and in her gaze I saw the crumbling of her pride, the dawning realization that the man she had dismissed was the very foundation of her present. And though she could not yet speak, the confrontation had already been delivered, not by me, but by the truth that no longer allowed her to hide. The fall of arrogance was not a sudden collapse, but a slow and painful unraveling that everyone in the room could witness. For as the in-laws continued to honor me with their words and gestures, my daughter's carefully built image began to crack in ways she could no longer conceal. And though she tried to hold her smile, her lips trembled, her eyes darted nervously, and her voice, once full of confidence, now faltered whenever she attempted to join the conversation. I watched as her shoulders slumped, her laughter forced and hollow, each attempt to regain her composure only highlighting the weight of her humiliation, because every compliment directed at me stood in direct contrast to the dismissal she had given me earlier, exposing her pride as nothing more than a fragile mask. The very people she had sought to impress now looked at her with questioning eyes, wondering how she could have treated her own father so lightly, and I could feel the tide of judgment turning against her, not with cruelty, but with the quiet disapproval that stings more deeply than harsh words ever could. Her fiancé, who had once worn arrogance as easily as his tailored suit, now regarded me with respect and her with uncertainty, his gaze flickering between us as though he was beginning to question the truth of the stories she had told about me, and in that flicker I saw her confidence falter even further. She tried to interrupt the praise directed at me by changing the subject to the wedding plans, but each time she spoke her voice sounded smaller, less convincing, and the in-laws, politely but firmly, turned their attention back to me, eager to hear more about the man they now realized had played such a crucial role in their success. The silence she had once tried to impose on me had been broken, and in its place rose a chorus of recognition that she could not quiet no matter how desperately she tried. And with every passing moment, her arrogance crumbled into dust. She lowered her gaze to her plate, pushing food around with her fork but barely eating, her cheeks flushed with shame, her hands fidgeting restlessly in her lap, and I knew that for the first time she was truly feeling the weight of her own choices, the weight of every word she had spoken against me. The pride she had carried like a shield, the pride that had led her to dismiss me as too poor, was stripped away by the truth of who I was. And now she sat exposed before her new family, her arrogance fallen like a broken crown at her feet. I felt no joy in her suffering, only the quiet satisfaction of justice, for I had not sought to humiliate her, but to let the truth speak for itself, and it had spoken louder than I ever could. Around us, the in-laws continued to honor me, Their voices warm, their gestures sincere, but every word they spoke was also a reminder to her that she had been wrong, that her attempt to distance herself from me had not only failed, but had backfired in the most public way possible. Her arrogance had promised her a seat among the powerful, yet now she found herself sitting in silence, while the power in the room shifted to the father she had tried to erase. And though I wished she would meet my eyes and find the courage to speak, she could not, for her shame held her captive. The fall of arrogance is a heavy thing, and as I watched her struggle against it, I knew this was the moment she would remember for the rest of her life. The moment when she learned that pride built on denial is destined to collapse, and that no matter how far she tried to rise above me, the truth of my devotion and my worth would always bring her back to face the reality she had so carelessly rejected. The father's triumph was not loud or boastful, but quiet and steady, a triumph that lived not in gloating words or proud gestures, but in the calm certainty that after years of sacrifice and silence, the truth had finally stepped into the light where no one could deny it. And as I sat there surrounded by the respect of those who once saw me only as a guest, I felt a weight lift from my chest, the weight of being dismissed, of being called too poor, of being pushed aside by the very daughter I had raised with my blood and sweat. My triumph was not in her humiliation, but in the recognition that I was seen at last for who I truly was, a man who had given everything for his family, a man whose wisdom and patience had built a foundation strong enough to support not only my daughter, but also the empire she now admired. I watched the way the in-laws leaned toward me, eager to hear my thoughts on matters of business, their voices warm, their eyes filled with gratitude, and though I answered them modestly, offering only measured words, I could feel the power of their acknowledgement settling deep into the room, shaping the way everyone, including my daughter, would now view me. For so long I had been the quiet figure in the background, the man who patched old shoes and wore simple suits, the father who ate little so his daughter could have more. Yet here, in this grand hall, my life's work had risen above appearances, speaking louder than fine clothes or polished manners ever could, and that was the triumph that filled me with peace. My daughter sat silent, her head lowered, her pride broken, and though some might expect me to relish her shame, what I felt instead was a bittersweet sense of justice, for this was never about revenge, it was about truth. And truth has a way of humbling even the proudest hearts. I thought back to all the nights I had walked home under the dim glow of streetlights, my body aching from long shifts, whispering prayers that my daughter would one day live free of hardship, and I realized that those prayers had been answered, even if the path to this moment had been painful. She had found her way into a family of wealth and influence, but tonight she also found herself confronted by the reality that none of it could have been possible without the father she had tried to deny, and that realization was the true victory, not for me alone, but for the truth itself. I sat straighter in my chair, not with arrogance, but with dignity, knowing that I no longer had to defend myself or explain my worth, for it was now plain to everyone in that room, undeniable and unshakable. The triumph was also in the lesson being taught, a lesson that respect cannot be bought with money or clothes or status, but must be earned through sacrifice, perseverance, and honor, and in that moment, I knew that even if my daughter never found the courage to say it aloud, she understood it in her heart. I glanced at her briefly, and though her eyes did not meet mine, I hoped she would carry this lesson with her, hoped she would one day come to me, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect and recognition of what I had done for her. The triumph was not the applause of others, but the quiet knowledge that I had lived my life with integrity, that I had never needed validation to keep going, and that when the time came, the truth spoke for me louder than any words ever could. In that room, surrounded by those who now looked at me with admiration, I felt a peace I had not known in years. The peace of a man who has endured betrayal yet finds justice in the end. And though my daughter's silence was heavy, I knew it was the beginning of her transformation, the first step toward understanding the depth of her father's love and the cost of her own pride. The final word rests with me, and as I sit here reflecting on that evening when everything came to light, I understand that what I carry now is not the bitterness of humiliation, but the calm certainty that respect is a truth that cannot be hidden, cannot be denied, and cannot be destroyed by pride or dismissal, for in the end it rises like the sun, steady and undeniable. I remember walking out of that grand hall, my steps slow but sure, the echoes of their gratitude still in my ears, their handshakes still fresh on my palms. And though my daughter trailed behind in silence, her head bowed beneath the weight of what she had learned, I felt no anger toward her, only the quiet release of years of unspoken sacrifice finally acknowledged. The final word is this: respect is not given by appearances or by the wealth one wears on their sleeve. It is earned through the choices we make, through the nights we endure without rest, through the hands that labor so a child can dream without limits. And on that day, before all who mattered to her, the truth of my life was revealed. My daughter may have once said I was too poor. She may have turned from me in shame. She may have built walls to keep me out of her new world. But the truth has a way of tearing down walls, and when it did, she was left with no choice but to see me as I truly am. I walked home that night not with triumph etched on my face, but with peace in my heart, because I knew I had lived my life with integrity. I knew I had given everything I could, and I knew that in the end, the lesson had been written not in my voice, but in the undeniable recognition of those who had once been strangers to me, yet knew my worth more than my own child had. The final word is not vengeance. It is not gloating. It is not the weight of bitterness pressing down, but the soft release of justice, of truth standing tall after years of being hidden in shadows. I think of her even now, the way her face burned with shame, the way her voice failed her when asked to explain. And though the memory carries sorrow, it also carries hope, hope that one day she will come to me with honesty in her eyes. Hope that she will remember not only the night she was humbled, but the years I carried her with love. The final word belongs to me, not because I spoke it aloud, but because it was carved into the very fabric of that evening, into the silence that followed the reveal, into the respect that filled the room like a tide. And in that silence, in that tide, the world saw what she had tried so hard to deny. And so I end this story not with anger but with peace, not with the bitterness of rejection but with the quiet pride of a father whose devotion was finally seen for what it was. And though my daughter will live with the memory of her arrogance, I will live with the comfort of knowing that in the end the truth prevailed. And the final word was never hers to give, it was mine, carried in the dignity of a life well lived and in the respect that can never be taken away. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.